Fred Conrad spent 36 years with the New York Times, capturing portraits, news, and feature stories. He had a keen ability to tell compelling visual stories and is well known for his artistic and technical proficiency. Conrad has photographed world-renowned figures and historic events, contributing to the visual legacy of the New York Times. Now, this episode of the Crit House is longer than most. It is that good of a conversation. Today on the Crit House, Fred Conrad discusses his 5 images from Bill Burke, Frank Hurley, Xinchang, Simon Norfolk, and Jeff Bridges.
So you have been a professional photographer for a long period of time, New York Times for a very long period of your career. How do you talk about yourself as a photographer? Like, somebody asks you what you do, who you are, how do you explain yourself?
Well, I went to the University of Michigan and graduated from the art school, and I majored in photography. And immediately after graduation, I went to New York, sold some photographs that I had taken at the state prison in Michigan to Time Inc. and McGraw-Hill. And with that grub stake, I actually moved to New York and started freelancing. When I think about myself at that period of time, I just shake my head because I didn't know anything. I had no idea about the business of photography. All I knew is that I wanted to be a photographer and I wanted to tell stories with pictures. And my New York experience shaped me in many, many different ways. And one of the joys about being a New Yorker is that you can be whoever you want to be and you can change. And I was very fortunate when I got hired by the New York Times at a period when the New York Times was reinventing itself. It had decided to become a national newspaper and to create multiple sections for the daily. And so the concept of photography and the use of photography was changing daily. All of a sudden, you had section editors that never existed before, like the home section or the dining section or the sports section. All of a sudden wanted different kind of pictures. It wasn't enough to have just sports action for the sports section. You had to have really compelling feature portraits. And for me, it was a thrill because I could go into work every day, not really knowing what I was going to do, but the excitement of knowing that I could be whoever I wanted to be that day and change. I could start my morning doing a magazine portrait of a financial titan down in Wall Street. And in the afternoon, I could photograph homeless sex workers living on a pier. It was like,
Yeah.
It was a lot of fun, but it was a challenge. And it was interesting because I didn't have all the knowledge or background that I needed. And so I started learning about other photographers and how they dealt with different situations, how they changed or how they developed. And because the Times was really looking for a different way of using photography, all of a sudden they wanted photographers who used lights. But most of the staff didn't want to have anything to do with using lights.
Yeah.
But I went out and bought my Dynalights and my first strobes, and I started doing portraits and other things. And I would do home interiors for like the home section. I'd do food, but then I'd also do portraits for arts and leisure. It was a blast. And when you didn't have anything to do, what did they do? They sent you out on the street to do street photography. I was
Really?
like, it's like candy. It's like, okay, we got no assignments for you. Go out and find me some art, like in the park. was like, okay, I'm there. It
Wow.
was, it was, it was a great job. And I owe a lot to the Times because not only did it give me the opportunity to change and morph in all sorts of different directions, but I got to rub shoulders with really intelligent reporters and editors who knew so much more than I ever did about everything. Part of the my learning about photography and how to cope with different aspects of being a professional photographer, I would look at other photographers' work and their biographies, and they really sort of led the way for me to becoming who I eventually became. And of course, unlike a lot of photographers who like to specialize in one aspect, only shoot sports or only shoot politics or only shoot in black and white or only shoot in color, I wanted to do it all.
And
And
you did, and you did.
and I did. And that was the fun part because I could change hats, midday if I wanted to. And that was the fun part about the job.
That's as you talk about it, I think, I sort of think about like the photographers who were sort of in the, the greats, I say in parentheses. Um, so many of them they do this, their street, their landscape, their portrait, or their whatever things. There aren't a lot of people who are able to, some, but not a lot, who can go from genre to genre to genre and do it all very well. And you're one of those who has done that.
Only because I could never make up my mind.
Or because you were good at all of them. So you've picked 5 images, which I know is a very challenging thing. What's the thread that goes from through these 5 images? How did you decide on what they were going to be?
All for different reasons. They each inspired me um, because of my personal experience, but also for finding solutions and an attitude. I mean, I think the first. You want to start with the first?
Yep. Well, let's do that. We'll start with the first one.
Oh, oh yeah,
And that first one is from Frank Hurley.
right.
Well, and let me just start by saying this. Um, the 5 images, the 5 photographers that you have shown, of the dozens of this series we've done in the Crit House, none of these photographers has been featured yet on this channel. So talk to us about Frank Hurley, and then we'll talk about the other ones as well.
All right. Well, Frank Hurley was an inspiration to me from the minute I saw his photographs. He was the photographer. He was an Australian photographer who had been hired to document the Shackleton's expedition to Antarctica. And of course, the reason he'd hired on, I learned later reading about it, was because he was bankrupt. His postcard business didn't make any money. He was desperate. And so he loaded up, his film cameras, his movie cameras, all of his chemicals and everything onto the ship. And then when they became icebound, like in Antarctica, Shackleton and a few others departed to hopefully, be able to rescue them. They weren't rescued for an entire year. And the thought of living on a ship that's slowly sinking, icebound in Antarctica for a year is so traumatic and depressing. The idea that this man actually had the gumption to get up every day and take pictures was an inspiration. This particular picture taken at night, and obviously in the wintertime in Antarctica, it's nighttime all the time. And using flash powder, he created like this ghost ship, this just remarkable. And of course, Hurley himself, was certainly a man with many flaws. He was a very big risk taker, and just knowing how his legacy was altered by the fact that so many of the pictures he later took during World War I were like composites. I mean, he's not a journalist,
Yeah.
but the mere fact that he was able to deal with exhaustion, anxiety, more than likely a lot of depression, and still produce was an inspiration to me. And I mean, I learned, from other photographers, that I've met. I mean, I think the first time I met James Nachtwey was in, I think, 1987 in Korea. And we were covering the presidential election in Korea. He was in the next room, and I, knocked on his door and invited him downstairs because myself and some other photographers were going to have a drink. He was going to bed. He was in bed by 9 o'clock. And I looked at his room. Not only was he going to bed at 9 o'clock, he had a humidifier. And he was popping vitamin C, like, it was like M&Ms. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is not this guy's first rodeo. He knows
How to
his
do it.
body. He knows what he has to do to be prepared. And it was an eye opener for me because if you really want to be able to be creative and produce on a high level, you also have to be aware of your body,
Mm-hmm.
both psychologically and physically. And if you can do that, then you can have a long and productive career. But if all you think is you have to have your cameras in tip-top shape, you're kidding yourself. So that's why Frank Hurley was an inspiration to me.
So your second image from Li Xinchang, or is it Li Xinchang Li?
I'm not sure. But he was an incredible inspiration. And his story and how his pictures were eventually published, again, is another inspiring story of what it means to be a photographer. I mean, he was a young man and he had just gone to university and, like myself, had gone to art school and studied photography. And he gets a job at a newspaper. And then the Cultural Revolution begins. He gets sent away to a re-education camp. He comes back. He realizes that if he's going to be able to take photographs of the Cultural Revolution, he has to become himself one of the Red Guards. And so the title of his book is Red Colored New Soldier. They wore an armband that identified them. And so that gave him the liberty and access to document this cultural revolution that was happening in China. And the newspaper would publish the politically acceptable photographs, the joyous demonstrations and everything else. But the mock trials where they humiliated people publicly, the executions, the dark side of the Cultural Revolution, those pictures were not published. But he kept them and he stored them for over 20 years in the floorboards of his little apartment. Okay. And I think in the 80s, there was like an opening and there was a photo show in Beijing. And Robert Pledge, who was the director of Contact Press Images, went to judge the show. He saw these pictures and was bowled over and said, we've got to do a book. Well, all's fine and good. They shake hands and we're going to do a book. A few months later, Tiananmen Square happens. There's an incredible crackdown. Certainly it's, you can't communicate with each other. Somehow they managed, months later, he would smuggle out an envelope with a few negatives, and then another envelope, another envelope. There were thousands of envelope correspondence between Robert Pledge in New York and Li Xinchang I believe he was in Harbin then. And it became a book. It was fantastic. This particular picture is interesting to me because this is the epilogue to the Cultural Revolution. This particular woman was, very much an entrepreneur, worked with a coal company and started embezzling funds and touting, like the Maoist, you know, regimes and everything else, successfully became a very wealthy woman. Well, eventually she was put on trial and executed. And he photographed all of it.
Hmm.
And so not only do you see like the all the different aspects of the Cultural Revolution, you see the epilogue to it. Because of one man's perseverance in trying to preserve history, which is really a very big lesson to learn. That even, I mean, I say this because, in my basement, I've got boxes and boxes of film, and only now am I starting to go through them and think, oh, maybe I should find a home for these. But it's important.
Yes.
And he knew it, and he persevered. And ironically, I think 15 or 16 years after the book was published, it was finally printed in China.
Bill Burke is your third photographer with this image.
I love Bill Burke's work. I mean, in many ways, he's like Frank Hurley. He's just crazy. um, he was actually a teacher at a university teaching photography, but in the summer breaks, he would go to Southeast Asia. And of course, this was during a period with a great deal of turmoil. He's going to countries like Laos and Cambodia and Vietnam. And I think his first famous book was I Want Take Picture. And so he actually had somebody translate that on and write it on his hand, and he would go up to strangers and say, I want take picture. Yeah. He happened on something that inspired me because he discovered that architecture can be almost as revealing as a person's face when you're talking about transition, conflict, and history. And so he started recognizing all of this colonial French architecture in Indochina and started, I think let's see, the title of the book is Autrefois Maison Privée, previously a private residence. And what was neat about it is that you really became curious about the place and the history by looking at buildings. And I thought, oh my gosh, that old saying, if these walls could talk.
Right.
All of a sudden they started talking, and you started seeing Art Deco in Vietnam, with Citroën tire factories and showrooms, and the fact that these buildings were being repurposed and going through another transition. They weren't going away, but their history wasn't going away either. It was there to be seen. And he recognized it and made a fantastic book. It's I really recommend it to anybody who really wants to go to a different place in photography, because he really touched on it.
Let's go to your fourth image from Simon Norfolk.
Oh my goodness.
First of all, let me just say, I love your reaction every time we go to a new image.
Well, I mean, here's a guy, he's an Englishman, right? And the United States is invading Afghanistan. The world press is flying in. Everybody's all set to do bang bang. And they're embedded with, like troops and everything else. Pretty much
bang, 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 meaning war.
Yeah,
imagery.
conflict photography. Yeah.
Conflict, yeah.
I mean, and look, it's a pretty one-sided affair.
Yeah.
And Simon shows up with a wooden 4x5 camera and 120 sheets of color chrome film. He comes away with, to my mind, the most important book about that conflict in Afghanistan. Because of the process of slowing it down and using this camera and getting the story. You look at his pictures from, his Afghanistan book, and you actually have an idea of where and what Afghanistan looks like.
Hmm.
All of the other photographs, he could have been in Iraq, he could have been in Iran. I mean, it's this is like, it's it's dramatic, it's up close, it's personal, it's violent, but you don't know where you are. And this cover, this picture that he put on the cover, was, I mean, the story behind it is what is intriguing, because the Taliban had outlawed the sale of balloons. And of course, Afghans have always enjoyed balloons. I mean, it's, that's a treat for a kid. It's
Yeah.
cheap, it's
Right.
inexpensive, it's colorful, it's, Taliban said no. So what's the first thing somebody does when the Taliban's gone? Goes out and starts selling balloons. That's a beautiful image.
That is. And a beautiful story too. Wow.
Yeah.
Huh.
But the whole book is a revelation. And the idea of only having 120 shots, okay, 4x5 with a view camera. What the hell are you gonna do? He pulled it off.
So he took 120 sheets
Yeah,
and created a book. I mean, I'm shooting 100,000 images and getting 5.
that's what I'm telling you. The man is an inspiration,
Yeah.
okay? Because he slowed it down.
Wow.
There was a much more thought into the whole process.
Your 5th artist image takes us in a direction that I was never expecting on this program, and we are looking at the photography of Jeff Bridges.
I met Jeff Bridges. He did a science fiction movie, I guess when he was, I guess, an alien. And I did a portrait of him for the arts and leisure section at the planetarium in New York City. And, it's a nice setting, and, nice portrait. And then he says, I want to show you something. I go, okay. And he takes me back to like his green room, dressing room area. And he's got like these photo books, these monographs that he produced. Now, years ago, he became enamored with a very, very funky camera, a wide lux, which is a 160-degree panoramic camera where the lens moves. And the backside, the film is on a curvature, so it's all in focus. And that technology goes back to almost the very beginning of photography. You'd be surprised. I mean, back in the 1870s, they had cameras that did the same thing.
Is that right? Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Hmm.
But he started documenting all of the movies that he was in, doing behind the scenes photographs. And then he would print them up and create these books. And then he would give the books to not only the actors and actresses, but to the crew as a memento of the movie. And I thought to myself, brilliant. Why didn't I think of that? Because when I realized all the moments in my career at the New York Times, how often I would go into the building and I would put my cameras down. I wouldn't take pictures of the newsroom. I wouldn't take pictures of what was happening around me. Why not?
Right.
Well, because I was unaware of the importance of documenting your environment and the process, because the newspaper is like a living thing. It's produces itself every 24 hours, and then it has different editions even within those 24 hours. It's it's a living thing, and I didn't realize that. And there are times and things that I think about that I wish that I had documented. And
Yeah.
and that's, you know, I mean, there are people that criticize me. Oh, he says he's no photographer. I says, no, he's an important photographer because he understands the importance of photography.
Fred Conrad, just a pleasure to talk to you. I don't know if people have noticed that you can't see it right now, but in the lower left-hand side of your camera, on the screen is not your name, but the name of Tina Loit,
Yes,
who is your
wife.
wife. Um, can you just talk a little bit before we wrap up? Like what's the and she was a photo editor at the New York Times for a
Yes.
good portion of the career. So you worked in some capacity together. How did that relationship manifest in your photography? Is that or did it?
My wife is very creative. Okay. But in a very different way.
Yeah.
Photography is in many in many aspects is a mechanical thing. Okay.
Yeah.
Uh, and bridging the mechanical and what you're trying to envision and whatnot is different. She's creative in a conceptual way. And she worked as a photo editor at the New York Times in several different areas. She was in the style section, she was in the food section, she was in Metro. She's very, you know, she loves to create order where there is no order. And most photographers, myself included, feel comfortable when there's chaos and no, there's no solving this chaos. It's just, you know. So she's very different than me and creative in a different way. And I hope you get the chance to talk to her and she can explain some of the things that she's done during her career.
Well, it is on the schedule for an upcoming episode of the Crit House myFIVE series. So, Fred, just a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much for joining us. What an honor and an education as well. You talked earlier about I forgot what you were referencing it, but you were talking about that was sort of an education for you, or was it somebody else? I can't remember. But this program for me is my master's in photography, and thank you for being my instructor for the day.
Okay, my pleasure.
And thank you all for watching the Crit House.